Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for the first of our 4 drought webinars. I think we sort of scheduled these hoping that it would bring some rains, and I think that it did across some parts of western Iowa, but we're definitely still much drier than we would like to be this time of year. So we're going to be addressing some management concerns and different topics for the next 4 weeks related to the drought that's occurring in western Iowa and seems like it's ever expanding into other areas. So make sure that you please join us for the next 3 Thursdays, August 6th, 13th, and 20th, again at 1 p.m., as we address some other topics related to the drought. So before we get started on our presentation, I'd like to cover just a few housekeeping things. So you'll notice if you kind of scroll your pointer across the screen, you might see that there is a chat down at the center of the screen, as well as a Q&A box. So that chat box will be a great place for us to communicate with you, as well as for you to communicate with us if you have any technology issues. So please use that chat box for technology problems. Also, please, if you have not provided us your CCA number and you would like credit for attending this webinar, please give us your CCA number in that chat box. Feel free at any point, if you have questions for our panelists, to go ahead and put those in the Q&A box. I will be moderating those questions, and we will be answering them as we're able to, primarily when our speakers finish presenting. I want to just take a moment and thank our partners for today's program, so the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, as well as the USDA Midwest Climate Hub. I very much appreciate their help in pulling this together, as well as our sponsors, the Iowa Corn Growers Association and the Iowa Cattlemen's Association. They've really been a tremendous help in getting the word out about this and communicating these issues across western Iowa. With that, I think I've covered everything that I wanted to cover. I may put some things in the chat box, but I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to our first speakers. At some point, we are going to have the Secretary of Agriculture, Mike Naig, pop in, and he'll share a few words with us. But we'll get started to begin with Justin Glisson, our state climatologist for the state of Iowa, as well as Dennis Toddy, the director of the USDA Midwest Climate Hub. So thank you, too, for speaking today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Megan. Thank you for the great introduction. Also, I want to thank Megan and Brent for getting these webinars up and going. They did a lot of legwork, so we are very appreciative of that. So what we'll talk about today, and yes, I'm Justin Glisson, state climatologist of Iowa. Work for the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, and my slides are there we go. So what we're going to talk about today in my section of the webinar are our current drought conditions and the situation and circumstances in which we got into this situation, especially in western Iowa. But then we'll also talk about where we're going. The next 7 days, rain-wise, the QPF, quantitative precipitation forecast, but also the short-term outlooks that kind of give us an idea of where we're moving temperature and precipitation-wise into the beginning of August. So here is the current U.S. Drought Monitor map of Iowa, which was issued this morning. These maps are issued every Thursday morning at 8 Eastern Time, and they are actually backdated to the previous Tuesday when data cutoff occurs. Now, what you can see on this map is we have expansion of all drought categories, D1 into more of eastern Iowa, then an additional expansion of D2 drought, which is that tannish color, darker tan color, towards the western side of the state, and then a little bit of D2 introduced in Plymouth County and surrounding counties. So we have seen a degradation in drought conditions across the state with a little bit of improvement across southern Iowa. During field scouting, I've done a few of these, also with our extension agronomists who do a phenomenal job across the state. We get a lot of pictures that help us match up impact reports with the moisture variables and other variables that we use to submit our recommendation to the U.S. Drought Monitor author. From Western Iowa, Mike Witt sent these to us. You can see corn firing up to the effectively where the ear would be, and then in Guthrie County, And then in Lanesboro, we have soybean leaves that are cupping. So we are seeing absolutely moisture stress across the west central, even in parts of western Iowa, given the lack of precipitation that we've had, combined with hot conditions earlier in the summertime. So this is the north central region of the United States, and we call this the class change map. So this is a 1-week change. Wherever you see those warm colors, that's where we've had a degradation in drought conditions across the state. So you see a lot of yellow there. That was a 1-class degradation. So a 1-class degradation means if we were in D1 drought, uh, it was downgraded to D2 drought this week. That's where you see those yellow colors. Now you do see a little section of south central, southwestern Iowa that actually received much needed rainfall over the last 7 days prior to data cutoff on Tuesday. So that aided in downgrade or upgrading those conditions across southern Iowa. This is an interesting plot. This is a plot going back to the first 2000, so 20 years ago. This is a drought time series. So your vertical axis there tells you the percentage of the state that is covered in each of those drought categories. D0, which is abnormally dry, not drought, but abnormal dryness, all the way up to D4. And as you can see, drought is variable across the state. Depends on the time of year, depends on the part of the state in which the drought is occurring. But what we can really notice here is the 2012-2013 widespread drought across Iowa and much of the Midwest. And then we had D3 conditions back in 2018, peak of drought, August 21st in southeastern counties. And then we had some D1 drought last year around this time in eastern and central Iowa. So we do see drought conditions starting to spike across the state, as you can see on the time series. So how did we get here? Let's look at some plots and maps that show us exactly the conditions on the ground, such as precipitation deficits, but also the occurrence of above average temperatures on a good portion of middle May into middle June and then into July. We'll also look at some hot and dry and windy days that really make the atmosphere thirsty for water, and the atmosphere will pull out surface water, subsoil moisture, even out of the crop when we do have these conditions that are very windy and dry. And then we'll also look at dwindling subsoil moisture. We came into the season with a pretty good amount of subsoil moisture after the second wettest year in 2018 and the 12th wettest year in 2019. Combine those 2 years together, you had the wettest 2-year stretch in 148 years of records for the state of Iowa. So we definitely had a lot of subsoil moisture coming in. This first plot here is a radar indicated rainfall for the state of Iowa, and this is the last 30 days as of this morning. Wherever you see those warm colors, that's where we're seeing precipitation deficits start to accumulate. So we're not seeing a rainfall that we expect. Wherever you see those cooler colors, that's where we're seeing above average rainfall. Now this plot is like a bullseye. Iowa is a bullseye in the Midwest, in much of the United States, given the dry conditions that we've had. We've had a lot of storm track issues that stay to the north, they stay to the south, or they stay to the west. But whenever we get systems that start to generate rainfall into the wetter or into the drier part of the state with no or little available low-level humidity and soil moisture, you're not able to fuel those thunderstorms. So we miss out on a lot of those rainfalls. If we look at the 90 days, so last 3 months, you can see we're really increasing the amount of precipitation deficits, especially in that west central corridor, Guthrie County, Greene County, where you see that red. Wherever you see those reds, that's anywhere from 8 to 12 inches below average. So a pretty substantial deficit in precipitation. And we do see that kind of expanding across western Iowa. On the flip side of that, eastern Iowa has had above average rainfall. Some of this is attributed to the tropical storm Cristobal that went through on June 9th. Finally, if we look back 6 months, you can still see that core of below average rainfall, our precipitation, 6 to 8, up into the 12-inch range. So we've had a persistent dry spot across western Iowa for a good stretch of time, 4 to 6 months. So that's where we start to see drought conditions can occur if atmospheric and surface conditions start to push through. What this map is here, this is the accumulation map for Guthrie Center, the National Weather Service co-op station in Guthrie Center. And what we're seeing here is that brown line is climatology, or what we expect, the 30-year average. The green line is the 2020 current accumulation year to date, and that red line is the lowest on record, 1965. These records go back to 1895, and as you can see, we're about 10 inches below average from the start of the year. This is the driest January through July since 1988, and it's the 11th driest year so far since 1895. So very dry conditions right where that red part on that radar indicated rainfall deficit that we see. If we look at subsoil moisture along with precipitation, we have to take into account the average temperature, or our highs and lows averaged together. The first plot here on the left is the last 90 days. The one in the middle is the last 60 days, and the one on the right is the last 30 days. Wherever you see that orange color, that's where we've been above average temperature-wise. And you can see in Western Iowa, in all three time frames, we've been above average for that given spot. Wherever you see that gray color, that's where we've been near climatology, or near normal. So we have definitely seen very warm conditions, especially across Western Iowa, going back a pretty good stretch of time. Another interesting thing that we want to look at is a period of time between the middle of May to the middle of June. If you remember back, we had a lot of windy, dry days with temperatures in the upper 80s, low 90s. When you get these kind of conditions, you really start to pull water vapor out of the surface, out of the subsoil, and you can start to dry off rapidly. Well, what this plot shows is anywhere you see green here, that's where the wind speed, daily average wind speed, was above average or faster than what we expect. As you can see, there's a corridor going from Texas all the way up into Western Iowa and the Dakotas. So we had very fast wind speeds, faster than what we expect for this time of year. Now, if we pull wind data from Sioux City's airport, what we see here on the top is 2018 at the same time. The bottom wind barb is the 2020, May 15th to June 15th. What we were seeing is higher frequency winds in that 15 to 25 mile per hour bin more often. And the daily average wind speed across the state was about 1.2 to 1.8 miles per hour greater than what we expect. So a very good amount of wind out there. The dominant direction was weird for this time of year, south-southeast. So we had combined with low-level dryness and temperatures above average, the atmosphere gets thirsty, high evapotranspiration from the surface into the atmosphere. So now let's look at subsoil conditions because these really reflect the deficits of rainfall that we've been getting. This is a NASA plot of subsoil moisture going down to 200 centimeters. Wherever you see orange on there, the percentiles meaning that if you think of subsoil as a sponge, the darker those, or the warmer those red colors, that's how much the sponge is not soaked. So anywhere from 90 to 95% holding capacity in Western Iowa. That tells us that the subsoil is below 10% in some regions, even below 5% of what is expected. So very dry soils. We're getting into corn maturity. Soybeans are starting to expend more water from the subsoil and transpiring it. We're losing that subsoil moisture pretty rapidly. And that's where we see a degradation in our drought conditions. I'll skip this plot. And where we're going. So this is the 7-day QPF. This tells us how much rainfall we can expect over the next 7 days. Anywhere from a quarter of an inch up to a half an inch, but this depends on where thunderstorms start to fire. So we've had a lot of forecast problems over the recent term where we haven't been getting rainfall where it's forecasted. If we look at our outlooks moving into the second week of August, we do see a good shot at elevated probabilities of cooler to near normal temperatures, along with a shot at wetter conditions across Western Iowa, which would be great. Finally, the 4 week outlooks going out into the middle of August do not give us a real clear indication on temperatures and precipitation. So we're kind of up in the air now. The final August outlook will be issued tomorrow morning, so stay on the lookout for those. Finally, I want to draw your attention to the Climatology Bureau page. This has all of the tools that you need: climate outlooks, subsoil moisture, subsoil conditions, historic reports, recent climatology maps, anything you can find. And hopefully it's structured in a way that you can really enjoy the content there. And with that, here's my contact information. Please feel free to email me or call. I'm always happy to chat, provide data, anything you need. So I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Justin. Justin set us up set me up in a good situation. We're going to riff off a couple more things that he talked about and take it from there on to discuss some additional details. Again, my name is Dennis Toddy, Director of the USDA Midwest Climate Hub. We are part of a set of 10 climate hubs nationally. We cover most of the Corn Belt. That's what the map is showing here. I want to talk a little bit more about conditions statewide, especially from a crop condition standpoint. These are maps from USDA NASS showing corn condition in the upper left-hand side, percent good to excellent, the percent dough at the bottom, and percent silking on the bottom right-hand side. Interestingly enough, despite the conditions we're having in the western part of the state, corn conditions in Iowa are still listed as of the beginning of the week at 80% good to excellent. And actually, Corn Belt conditions, the corn condition is ranked worst in the eastern part of the Corn Belt, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, where they're in the 40–50% range of good to excellent. One's a testament to types of crops, but also probably the isolated nature of the eastern part of the state being relatively good conditions, the western part of the state being the worst of it, and still managing to work its way through overall. From a soybean standpoint, you see very similar conditions. Iowa's 79% good to excellent. And again, the eastern part of the Corn Belt is much worse overall from that standpoint. Other states around us, especially to our north, are all similarly good, where we've had some overall decent rainfalls. It would be good if we had some more detailed district maps to be able to show you these conditions, but the NASS data doesn't get down to that kind of resolution. One more of these: pasture and range conditions on the upper left-hand side, and I just threw oat conditions in on the lower right-hand side. Note that these graphics are not available to the general public. They are shared with me via a colleague at another part of the USDA, the Office of the Chief Economist. His name is Brad Rippey. This is the other issue. I don't know that we'll talk today, but we'll talk about in other presentations. 56% grassland, pasture land in good to excellent condition. A lot worse to our south and west, but this is in part of the state an issue that that we've had reported from the western part of the state is overall dry conditions. Okay, Justin talked a little bit about the U.S. Drought Monitor, and I want to talk a little bit more about what goes into the U.S. Drought Monitor and the importance of the Drought Monitor. If you're not familiar with this product, it is, again, a weekly product produced throughout the week, released Thursday morning, valid Tuesday morning. It lists drought conditions from areas in white that are no drought. Yellow is abnormally dry, up to D4, exceptional drought. Some pieces of information to explain what goes into this. Here I've shown you the national map from this morning, that we are, again, on the Drought Monitor side, the worst in the Corn Belt, some drought issues in the eastern Corn Belt, lots of problems in the western part of the U.S. We can talk about that another time if you would like to discuss that. And even up in the far northeastern U.S., some drought issues up in that area. But what goes into that is probably what's most important. It's not a single number that goes into this. There's a lot of pieces of information that go into it. The process is there is a person each week that draws this map, but there's input that they use from a bunch of different indicators and indices, a bunch of different objective data, measured data, assessed kinds of data that go into creating the Drought Monitor map. And then there are subjective things, the reports that of what conditions are looking like, what the situation is on the ground, graphical images, whatever, we have the ability to say, hey, here's what it looks like in this area, and then make suggestions for what that drought monitor situation looks like. So it's called a hybrid approach. It's not a number that says, here's what it is. There's a bunch of different numbers to go into that. So that's why we'll talk more about the importance of impact reporting here in a little bit. We talked about the drought categories. Again, the D1 to D4 are considered drought. The D0 abnormally dry is considered just that, dry, not actually drought. We look at, and the term that they use is called convergence of evidence. A lot of these different indicators can tell you different stories. We've been having lots of conversation about Western Iowa because depending on what data you look at, you can see a wide range of potential categories, so you try to use what most of the indicators are saying. Are you a D3? Are you a D2? Whatever, and try to use that. So there's not one thing that says the same thing all the time, and then what's called the convergence of evidence. Look at a bunch of different of the pieces of the data. It's not a model, okay? It's a point in time. It's not telling you what's going to be coming up. It's telling you where we are right now based on the set of conditions. So it's looking at data, and it also does not look at there are some things that kick off with USDA because of this. One more thing about this, the categories line up to, again, percentiles. Percentiles are 0 to 100 ranking. So like something that is D4 is considered first or second percentile should numerically show up one to two times every 100 years or something along those lines. The D2 would be 6th to 10th percentile, once every 20 to once every 10 years, or something along those lines from that basis. So that's the percentile rankings are the things that is really important. Not just numbers below or above average, but where do they rank on this scale? Let's jump through these. This is the list of the indicators. This is a list of part of the things that go in or used for part of the U.S. Drought Monitor. Not everything tells you the same thing across the country because there are a lot of different places and things that work across the country. There's lots of different satellite information that is used that is part of this too. Okay. Here's an important point. That why we want the drought monitor to be as appropriate as it can be. It does trigger some USDA programs, livestock forage program, emergency assistance for livestock, honeybees, and farm-raised fish. We won't go into the details of these, but the categories of the drought monitor for a certain period of time trigger certain USDA programs. I would check with your local farm service agency to learn more about these and ask more questions, but that's why we want them to be appropriate that way. Okay, a couple more things about how you can be involved. One of those is that you can report drought impacts to us, your local extension person. You can report to Justin or myself directly about what you're seeing around you, because that, again, is part of what goes into the drought monitor, numbers, but also what the impacts are seeing related to that. There's another way you can also do as part of this. Because precipitation, and this year we had lots of reports of precipitation is variable. It is always variable in the summertime, but it shows up much more importantly when we have dry conditions, because an inch rainfall can make a big difference here between getting some kind of a crop and getting nothing. So one way that we can help track that and assess how much we get on the ground is becoming part of CocoRAS. CocoRAS is a volunteer precipitation monitoring effort that is really quite simple. You go to the CocoRAS website, get yourself this 4-inch rain gauge, and set that up, and you can start reporting. And that's all there is to it. And it's a great benefit to be able to tell us during wet periods how much rainfall there is, or during dry periods, it's really important to say when you didn't get rainfall. Because sometimes radar can indicate that, well, look, they might have had an inch of rainfall there when maybe they only had 0.4 of an inch. And that's a big difference this time of year, and any time to know that sort of thing. So it is data that is collected, and whenever you enter it each day, it is immediately available on the website. It shows up on a map. We can look at it. National Weather Service can look at it. We incorporate that data into our recommendations. The other part about this is that you can report on cocoa raws of what the drought situation is looking like, what the impacts look like around you. If you also want to report, the U.S. Drought Monitor, the National Drought Mitigation Center, has a drought reporter where you can go. That's what's shown here on this right side. What conditions look like in your area, and you can say, here's what's happening around them, and that data also gets incorporated into the U.S. Drought Monitor. Okay, one more piece of information. If you want to get some of the outlook information, some of the NOAA outlooks with an ag context, we create one of those about every 2 weeks throughout the summertime. The link is right here. You can you can Google Midwest Climate Hub outlooks and find where we are. And if you want to, you can there also sign up for our email list, and you can find out, you get emails when they are updated. So last piece, here's contact information. My phone number and email are in the middle there if you have need to get in contact with us. And that ends the weather and climate part of this.
And just while we're working on transitioning to our next presenter, Mark Licht, ISU Cropping Systems Agronomist, I thought I would toss a question out that I have heard, and I think Justin even noted it in his portion of the presentation, where he basically said that there have been scenarios this summer where we've had a nearly 100% chance of rainfall, right? All but certain, and then it just turned out to be absolutely nothing. And I've heard that numerous times from farmers. So I was curious whether you could just take just a second and comment on the accuracy of these forecasts, and whether there's something just really unusual happening this summer, or is this something that happens often that maybe we just notice when we really need the rain?
Right. Excellent question. So we're in a weird period. Summertime is always difficult to get an accurate forecast of where these thunderstorms, where these mesoscale complexes are going to pop up. Where they do pop up, they get obviously the beneficial rain. Where they don't pop up, we get into drought conditions if they continuously miss out on that rainfall. This year has been very odd. I mean, 2020, we're talking an odd year as well. But we've had a lack, given COVID, we've had a lack of, or a very big decrease in the amount of commercial airline travel, as well as cruise ships in the oceanic basins. So these planes and these cruise ships take measurements. They take temperature measurements, they take relative humidity measurements through the depth of the atmosphere and across the ocean basins. And then these observations are ingested into the forecast models, both short-term and longer term. Well, if you decrease the amount of observations that are being pumped into these forecast models, you're going to destroy the skill of these forecast models. And destroy is a little harsh, but we do start to mimic behavior that's not necessarily physically based in the atmosphere. And hence, you get 80 to 90% probability of getting rainfall overnight, and it doesn't fall. So that is part of the reason why the forecasts have just been a little off over the past few months.
Oh, well, before we turn it over to Mark, it looks like the Secretary of Agriculture has actually just been able to join us as a panelist. So thank you, Mike, for joining us today. And I understand you maybe just had a few comments that you'd like to give here between presenters.
Well, thanks, Megan, and for taking me as I bop in here, kind of late, and but really, all I want to just jump in, and I'm going to be able to listen in for just a little bit here. Of course, very concerned about what we're seeing in terms of a drought increasing across the state. It's not just something that's predominantly focused on Western Iowa, as those of you on this webinar likely know, but boy, we've seen it start to stretch east, and in fact traveled in central Iowa, north central Iowa yesterday, and saw some of it myself, and so we know that the situation really calls for significant rain across large swaths of the state. So really just wanted to thank everybody who's participating today, the great partnership with our friends at Iowa State Extension, Dr. Glisson, the state climatologist, Iowa Department of Agriculture, and USDA. Just thanks everybody for being a part. I really liked to see that you all were moving ahead with these webinars. I think this will be good information for folks to understand what's happening, and we need to stay on top of it. So I won't belabor that. I want you to keep going with the program, but thank you to all the partners who have come together to put this program on. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you, Secretary. We appreciate you being able to drop in here today. So like I said, we'll move on here and we'll discuss some of the effects that the conditions that we're seeing out in West Central Iowa are having on corn and soybean right now. We were able to get out in West Central Iowa with Mark Licht. Was that just earlier this week? Because it feels like it was a lot longer ago. And Mark will visit with us about this now. So thank you, Dr. Licht.
Yeah, Megan, it was just earlier this week, believe it or not. And I know you've been out monitoring things for several weeks. So, so I'm going to talk just a little bit here about the corn and soybean response to drought. And as it's been mentioned, there's going to be varying degrees of this depending on, basically, when the drought stress started to occur and how severe stress that we really have. And so I'll try to point out some differences as we go along, but just wanted to maybe first, show what some of these symptomology, really looks like on the corn side of things. And so on corn, we really start to see those leaves rolling up. It's a mechanism that helps the plant try to remain cool, but also conserving moisture, minimizing transpiration. And so that's what the actual plant is really trying to do when it rolls those leaves up. Once we get into very severe conditions, and I apologize, this is actually a picture from 2012, but you can really start to see that in really severe conditions, you will get premature crop death. You'll get, whether it's this year or past years, you really start to get some pretty big variability across the field. So you may have, something like this bottom picture where you have premature crop death, and then it kind of radiates out from there and gets a little bit better. But you can kind of see off in the backside there where you do still have, a fairly green crop there. So there's going to be a lot of variability. When Megan and I were out on Monday, we were in some fields that had, plants that were just starting to pollinate, and we had plants that were nearly into the dough stage. So that gives you a sense of what that true variability is going to be there. When you really get inside that canopy, you do get leaf firing. In this case, we're maybe halfway up to that ear leaf on the left picture, much further along in that right picture, right? But that firing is basically the plant can't support the leaves that are there, so it starts to let them senesce and try to preserve as much moisture and nutrients as it can for producing grain. So when I think about the effects and think of this in a way that is somewhat useful in trying to determine what's going on, it really comes back to what does that grain production look like, and where are we at with things? And so in many of the fields that we were in on Monday, we had ears that had kernel rows in the 16 to 18 around area. Sometimes we'd find some 14s, and sometimes we found 20s, but a lot of times there were 16 to 18 around. Well, it helps to remember that this dry conditions really started to come in as we got into mid to late June. Well, by the time we were in mid to late June, that initial ear formation in those kernel rows had already been determined. That's determined somewhere in that V5 to V7 growth stage area. Ear length was quite variable. There were some ears that were 35 to 40 kernels long. Other ears, where we would barely just get to 20 kernels long. Ear length, or the number of kernels long, is determined in that mid to late vegetative time period. That determination really carries into about the blister stage, but those potential kernels are set, 7 to 10 days prior to pollination, ultimately. So, as we think about this, some of the earlier planted corn may have been a little bit further along in that ear development, and so you might not necessarily see as much of an impact. Whereas in more severe areas, we could have ear length shortening just because we had more severe conditions limiting that development as we were trying to set that maximum number. Pollination, surprisingly, as we were out there, we did see very few missing kernels or smaller late pollinated kernels, but there is some of that out there. So in this left picture, right around Megan's fingernail, you can see a couple kernels there that were pollinated, but definitely pollinated later than the rest of the year. And then on that same ear, you can see ovules that just did not pollinate. And so that is a potential. You'll see that probably more commonly on the tip of the ears, more so than scattered, or at least that's what we were seeing that day. The picture to the right, again, this is maybe a little bit of an anomaly, but in a field that was more severely affected, we did have this, what I would call a zipper ear, where just on the one side of the ear we had very poor pollination. In this case, it was the side of the ear away from the stalk. And so there will be some of that out there in the more severely affected areas as well. But overall, the temperature at the time of pollination was not an issue that critically would have set things back. So generally speaking, pollination should have occurred just fine. The next part, and this is kind of where we're at now in some fields, we're in that early grain fill stage, right? And so there is some tipping back. In some places it's, maybe only a half inch. Other places it's greater than 2 inches. Again, the more severely, drought prone areas are really showing this tipping back, or at least what I'm calling tipping back, where either kernels aborted or those resources are being devoted to the kernels toward the middle and butt of the year. So some of those kernels in that transition area are going to end up drying out and being essentially chips that get blown out the back of the combine. And so there will be a little bit of variation through there, but it is something that is occurring, and we are going to see. Kernel size. So a lot of what we were seeing on Monday in this kind of the western part of central Iowa and west central Iowa, we are seeing smaller kernels for the most part. That kernel size is, it occurs basically in the pollination blister and milk stages. And so, we're really setting that kernel size up on that early side of the grain fill period. And obviously we've been on the drier side of things, especially in that area. This is also an area as we talk about the spreading of the drought conditions. So other areas on the kind of the margins of where we were this past Monday may start to see some of those kernels being a little bit smaller, but have normal sized ears otherwise. And then, we're still in that process of determining that final kernel weight. That's really going to come about as we get into the dough stage and the dent stages, when we really start packing starch and the final kernel weight in there. So, it's a little bit that needs to be determined here, because we can get some, if we can get, and I'll look at Dennis and Justin for this, if we can get some rainfall and some cooler temperatures, we really could get some decent kernel weights still, or we have the potential for that. But if we don't get some rainfall, those kernel weights will likely be on the lighter side of things. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on yield estimations, but this is a time frame when we, especially in the more severely affected areas, we start thinking about what are our alternative options. And so when we think about yield estimations, it's ears per acre, it's kernel rows, it's kernels per row, and then are dividing those by kernels per bushel. Well, the top part of that equation is relatively easy to estimate, especially right now. We can go out and we can do counts to determine the top part of that. It's this kernels per bushel that is really hard to estimate. Normally and the rule of thumb is 90,000 kernels per bushel. But when we get into stressful conditions, this is going to be a little bit higher number. And if we get into really stressful conditions, we could be talking something around 100 to 110,000 kernels per bushel. So something in that range, if we're really looking at trying to make some yield estimations, especially right now, we do want to adjust the number of kernels per bushel for these stressful conditions here. Switching off onto the soybean side of things, as we look at soybean fields, you a lot of times start to get a silver tinge to them, and that's just a mechanism. Again, I'll show that in a little bit closer detail. In more severely affected areas, and this is a hill slope that shows it really nicely, where we already have some of those hill slopes that are prematurely dying, right? Where the color looks like the same color as the grass waterways in the pasture in that image. So there are some areas that are starting to show that severe injury already. But and here's another picture showing that severe area where they just prematurely died, and then it starts to feather out from those areas where we get some plants that are still showing stress, all the way to plants in the very upper part of that image where they're showing very little stress. So what we're really seeing on those soybeans when they give us that silver tinge is they're really folding those leaves up, putting basically the top part of the leaves facing each other as they fold up. And again, this is just their mechanism of reducing transpiration and trying to conserve moisture. And so you can really see that occasionally, if you get this early on, occasionally you'll get some sun scald, and the back side of those leaves will turn a golden color or a sunburn color, which at times does get confused with Cercospora leaf blight. The main difference here is that Cercospora leaf blight is going to be on the top side of the leaves, and sun scald generally, because of the wind and the way that they're folding, they'll sometimes have a more of a distinct line across them, where Cercospora leaf blight on the top side is going to be a little bit more of a random pattern. So when we think about soybean response here, some of the soybeans that are more severely affected and started to get affected in June, early July timeframe, they may have prematurely stopped flowering. Aborted flowers is very common when we get into severe conditions. The percent of flower abortion will also go up even in lightly or less severely affected drought areas. Pod setting, we could have fewer pods, definitely, and that's very common once we get into more severely affected areas. Right now, it is just simply too early to talk about that seed fill and number of seeds, because we're just on the front side of where we're going to be filling out those seeds and starting to get them. In this image here, it's a soybean plant that there are no flowers on it, and we would expect, in a normal growing season, we would expect flowering for another 7 to 14 days. You can see that the pods on those nodes are quite small. Matter of fact, toward the upper part, you can see some flowers that have dried up and aborted already. And so this is obviously not one of those areas that's severely affected where we have premature drought, but it's kind of in the in-between area, I would say. So one thing that I should note with soybeans, and we talk about this a lot, rain makes grain in July for corn, but if we get some rains in August, we can see these soybeans respond. If we're early enough in August, we can see some new blooms going on, new pods being set. But definitely, if we get some rains in August, it will help with seed fill. It'll help with that seed size and the number of seeds per pod if we can get those rains yet. And so it's definitely too early to really start talking and trying to figure out exactly where we're at with soybeans as far as yield potential and trying to determine some of those yield components. Again, just wanted to show, the same thing here on soybeans as far as yield estimations. In a couple of weeks, it'll be easy to determine that top part, number of plants, number of pods, number of seeds. But again, it's that seeds per pound that's going to be hard to determine. Normally, soybeans have a pretty big range. It could be 24 to 26, 2,700 seeds per pound. Stressful conditions will likely be over 3,000 seeds per pound. It's just a matter of, what does that seed size, seed weight end up being as we get into August and whether we get some rainfall to help produce some of that seed. So maybe a way to look at this is what can we do now, or what can be done now as we think of these crops and as we're out assessing some of these impacts. And so the first thing, and I'll give Megan all the credit, she was the one that reminded me of this. The first thing is really getting out there and checking for spider mites. She started to see some in her travels, and in this case, if they are severe enough, there may be a need to go out and apply an insecticide, to protect the yield that is out there. So it may be a factor of determining what the cost of that application is versus what we think we're going to have as far as yield potential. We can already start making harvest plans. Realize that the stems and stalks of these plants are going to be thinner. We're going to have to adjust the snapping rolls on the corn heads. With seeds being smaller, we're going to have to adjust fans. We're going to have to adjust sieves, so that way we keep the grain in versus losing grain on the ground in the field. And then think about post-harvest plans. And so do we want to think about no tillage and trying to conserve any fall soil moisture for the 2021 growing season? If we're thinking about cover crops, and if we've been using cover crops, we may want to start paying a particular attention to the weather forecast and maybe trying to do the seeding of those ahead of good chances of rain, or getting into a pattern where we have a more reliable rainfall, just as a way of getting better establishment there. If we're overly concerned, and if we really want to make sure that we don't use up too much moisture or have competition issues from that cover crop, we can look at planting oats, which would winter kill, especially if we're able to get in there and do some seeding on that a little bit earlier. So a couple things that we can be thinking about and planning for in the coming weeks to get us thinking, what can we do now as we make those plans for the rest of the year. So with that, I will take some questions if there are any here, and then we can go from there.
All right, so as we said, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to share those in that Q&A box. We have had a couple questions go in there that have been at least partially answered by Justin and Dennis. They just typed some answers in there, so hopefully everyone can see that. Justin may know more about this, or perhaps the secretary would know more about what the sort of benchmarks are for releasing maybe CRP acreage, or perhaps triggering some changes in county programs, or perhaps even like USDA statewide programs based on the drought monitor. And maybe somebody could give a little bit of an update on that. I'm not sure I feel that I have an expertise in this, but perhaps somebody else on the presentation does.
I think Dennis might have some thresholding on at least the USDA side. I know I work with the county FSA offices to provide them with precipitation observations for previous months plus the current month and then we go off of that for possible county level CRP. But I think there are other driving mechanisms, and Dennis probably knows more about that than I do.
That's right, because everybody in USDA knows everything about what's going on in USDA, right? Yes. I believe the livestock forage program is 8 weeks at D2, or if you reach D3 at all, then it triggers that immediately. The other ones, I am not sure what the triggers are for those. And note that those are not the only triggers for those. The idea, these were put into the Farm Bill, and they were meant to ease the process of qualifying, that if the drought monitor reaches this level or this category for this time period, we'll kick in with these programs. But then there are other ways of doing that too. Okay, somebody just typed in counties that are currently in D2 eligible for emergency haying and grazing effective August 2nd. So yeah. Yes, I can find out more, but I think your local FSA office and the state board would probably be the quicker one to be able to deal with these issues.
Yes, the county and state offices are great resources to everyone. Thanks for answering that question, guys. So Mark, I've got one here for you. So is there a potential for aflatoxin concerns in corn, or potential concerns for maybe some nitrate issues that we might see?
Okay. I want to be very cautious because whenever we get into drought conditions, yes, there is a potential for nitrate concerns. There is a potential for aflatoxin. Some areas may have had what I would term, kind of a step one for aflatoxin development as far as the right conditions during pollination. But there is also a step two that has to occur, and we have to have the right conditions as we go into maturity and as we get to, or in the weeks following maturity. Unfortunately, I'm not a true expert in the sense that I always have to look up what those exact conditions are. So I don't want to say that, but what I would say is if you're in those severely affected areas, yes, put that on your radar. Think about that. Kind of thinking of making harvest plans. I know from an insurance standpoint that has to be adjusted in the field. Once it is harvested and in a wagon or in a bin, it becomes a different component as far as being able to make those claims on insurance. So, and typically I would say that once we do get closer to harvest or the very beginning of harvest, a lot of times from the aflatoxin standpoint, if one field's detected, there tends to be a very quick spread and everyone knows about it very quickly. So then we're able to kind of adjust those harvest plans, make sure that we get the insurance side of it taken care of. As far as stock nitrates, this is a concern, especially if you're looking at harvesting it for forage in cattle. The lower part of those stalks will have will likely have a higher concentration of nitrates in them. This is something that we will be covering in probably the next one, if not the following one, in a little bit more detail as we get a better understanding of how much interest there is in that, and as we get a little bit better idea on how severe some of these areas are, and if that's really going to be a good option or not.
Yeah, that's a great point. So just another little plug-in that we are going to be continuing this series, and the next session is actually going to cover some of these topics about these maybe hay ground and pastures that are burning up a little bit, and then some concerns about harvesting for silage and things that we need to be thinking about from a forage standpoint. And then the following one on the 13th, Chad Hart is going to be talking about some crop insurance considerations and crop marketing. And then on the August 20th one, we're actually going to do final considerations for harvest, so some of those grain quality things. So it looks like we've got one more question here, and I think we've got time to answer it. And this is a good one, right? This is the question that we get all the time. Are total numbers of bushels of corn and beans impacted by the Western Iowa drought? And I think this is getting at something that I hear about from farmers a lot, which is why don't the markets seem to be noticing us? Or how big of an issue is this drought? And is this going to put a dent in some of our corn and soybean production numbers? What do you think, Mark?
So in the grand scheme of things, this is a smaller area. If we go back and we think about 2018, that was a relatively small area in southeast Iowa, stretching into a little bit of central Iowa. So this is a little bit larger than 2018, but not nearly as large of an area as 2012. And so it will definitely drop yields in the west central crop reporting district. It may affect yields slightly in the central Iowa crop reporting district. But on the statewide scale, you have to keep in mind that there are parts of the state, eastern Iowa, that look really good right now, have a lot of soil moisture. So even with the dry conditions worsening in areas, they may be able to offset some of this. So I'll say it's a little bit hard to predict that, especially as we're just on the front half of the grain filling period right now.
Dennis, did you have a comment to make about this?
Not about this, but about something else that Mark mentioned about harvest conditions, looking ahead of what we're looking at for harvest. One thing we didn't talk about was what the potential for harvest is. With the heat we've had this year, we are mostly ahead of average on most of our crops and premature drying down because of stress in some of those. So unlike last year where we had great concern about delayed crop development, that shouldn't be a problem this year as we're heading towards thinking about when frost or freeze is occurring. We have a tool we can track that, but on a widespread basis, I don't see this being an issue unless we have an incredibly early freeze, which we don't see anything about right now.